She was just 15 when her future was decided for her. No dreams, no voice, just obedience. Years later, that same girl, now a mother, stood before a court accused of murder. She confessed. Then she recanted. She told them she was manipulated, lied to, abandoned, but no one listened. This is not just a story about a crime. It's a story about what happens when the law ignores the lived pain of women, about how loyalty can be used as a weapon, and how justice, when blind to context, becomes another form of punishment. Her name was Nasrin Vaziri, and what happened to her should never happen again. Welcome to the Crime Series, where we bring you real stories that matter. If you care about justice, truth, and powerful storytelling, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. And as always, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. In the mountainous heart of western Iran, far from the urban sprawl of Tehran, lies the small conservative town of Darvashan, a place where ancient traditions are woven into daily life, and change is more feared than embraced. Among its narrow streets, clay brick homes, and prayer calls that echo at dusk, lived a girl named Nasrin Vaziri. Born in 1987, Nasrin was the only daughter of Bahram Vaziri, a local mechanic, and Soraya, a tailor who stitched wedding dresses by hand in the cramped backroom of their home. Theirs was a family of routine and reputation. Her father's hands were always black with grease, and her mother's fingers always pricked from sewing needles. They worked long hours, lived frugally, and expected little from life, except that their children follow the rules, and above all, obey. From an early age, Nasrin stood apart. She was soft-spoken but observant, the type of child who noticed things others overlooked. The tired look in her mother's eyes, the weight of silence after her father's outbursts. Her teachers described her as intelligent, introspective, and emotionally mature beyond her years. She read whatever books she could borrow from the local library. Novels, poetry, and once a psychology textbook she refused to return. Nasrin often wrote in journals, hiding them beneath her mattress. In them, she poured her dreams of becoming a psychologist, of helping women speak truths they'd been forced to bury. She wrote about her longings to attend university in Shiraz, to live in a city where people didn't whisper about a girl walking home alone. But dreams don't always survive in places like Darvashan. By 2001, she was already a teenager. Her family began to mention her future in conversations she wasn't invited into. They spoke of potential husbands, of dowries, of reputation. At first, she pretended not to hear. But one evening, as her mother hemmed a neighbor's bridal gown, she quietly tells Nasrin that a girl's life doesn't begin when she chooses, but it begins when she's chosen. The man who would claim her was Hamid Alizadeh. He was born in the rural village of Nazarabad, a tightly woven community where honor, reputation, and obedience shaped the rhythm of daily life. Located on the outskirts of provincial Iran, Nazarabad was the kind of place where generations lived and died in the same homes, and where deviation from custom was quietly corrected or completely erased. Hamid was the eldest of 5 children in a household ruled by structure and control. His father, a retired military officer, brought his discipline home with him. His mother, Parvin, was a full-time housewife, a quiet traditional woman who spent her life raising children, tending the household, and upholding the family's reputation. She was respected in the neighborhood for her modesty and firm belief in the old ways. Together, they raised their children to value duty over desire, and silence over dissent. From an early age, Hamid stood out, not for brilliance or charm, but for his compliance. He didn't question rules, he didn't push boundaries, he preferred structure, solitude, and routine. While other boys played in alleyways and challenged curfews, Hamid kept close to home, kept quiet, and kept to himself. At 18, he joined a local freight business as an assistant. By his early 20s, he had obtained a commercial driving license and began work as a full-time lorry driver. Hamid wasn't socially active. He avoided public gatherings and formed few relationships outside his immediate family and work colleagues. His seriousness, to many, was a sign of discipline and reliability. To others, it was emotional distance disguised as composure. By the time he turned 32, Hamid was unmarried. They began seeking a suitable match, someone young, obedient, and deeply rooted in tradition. Through extended family ties, they arranged a union with Nasrin Vaziri, a young girl from Darvishan. Her age was seen not as a concern, but a convenience, someone moldable, someone who wouldn't resist. Nasrin met him only once before the wedding. He asked no questions about her interests, made no effort to make her laugh. He simply stared at her as if inspecting a product. She felt more like an item being passed along than a person beginning a new chapter. Her silence was read as consent. In truth, she didn't know how to say no, and no one would have listened if she did. At that very young age, Nasrin was married in a small ceremony attended by relatives, neighbors, and a cleric who barely looked at her as he read the vows. Her dowry included handmade quilts, a copper cooking set, and a second-hand sewing machine. There was no celebration, just a quiet dinner afterward and a long night of uncertainty. Hamid was not physically abusive, but he was cold, distant, and controlling. He monitored her phone calls, discouraged visits to her family, and insisted she never leave the house without permission. He was rarely affectionate, never asked her opinion, and dismissed her attempts to speak her mind as childish nonsense. Her books were boxed up, her journals discarded. In Darvishan, a woman's silence was seen as virtue. But Nasrin's silence was born from suffocation. By the time she was becoming a young adult, she gave birth to a daughter, Zara. The child was healthy, with thick black hair and large eyes that reminded Nasrin of her younger self. Zara became her solace, her only light in a world that had dimmed long ago. Motherhood grounded her, gave her purpose, but it also deepened the walls around her. With a child now in her care, Nasrin felt even more trapped in a life that wasn't hers to begin with. Her husband, proud of becoming a father, remained unchanged in temperament. He saw Zara as a symbol of continuity, a reason to expect even greater obedience from Nasrin. He reminded her often that everything she had, her roof, her child, her respect, was because he provided it. Her dreams, her mind, her voice, all were irrelevant now. Outside their home, the town continued its routines. Market stalls opening at dawn, children walking to school, and neighbors trading gossip in hushed tones. But inside, Nasrin lived in quiet torment, raising a daughter in the same cage that once closed in on her. She was a wife, a mother, a caretaker, but not yet free. And while Darvishan had already written her future in stone, Nasrin was quietly, desperately rewriting hers in her heart. What she didn't know then was that the path she was on, shaped by other people's choices, would soon take a turn so dark, so irreversible, it would cast a shadow far beyond the narrow streets of her hometown. Before we continue, take a moment to reflect. How many girls like Nasrin are living lives they never chose, trapped by silence, tradition, or fear? This story isn't just a tale from another country. It's a reminder that every society, no matter how modern, has corners where injustice hides in plain sight. If you or someone you know feels voiceless, isolated, or unheard, please know this. You are not alone. There is help. There is hope. We share stories like Nasrin's not to reopen wounds, but to spark awareness, conversation, and change. Because sometimes it only takes one shared video, one open comment section, or one act of listening to begin rewriting someone's future. Like this video if you believe no one should be punished for surviving. Drop a comment if this story touched you, or if you know someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe, because here, we tell the stories that others won't. Let's keep this conversation going, because the more we speak, the less they can bury the truth. By 2008, Nasrin Vaziri had grown accustomed to the quiet despair that filled her days. Her life, which revolved around her daughter Zara and the suffocating routine of marriage to Hamid Alizadeh, a man who controlled her life even from afar. Hamid was often away driving freight routes, but his absence didn't mean freedom. Every step Nasrin took, every word she spoke, remained measured and monitored. Her only reprieve came in the form of Reza Kamali. Reza was not a native of Darvishan. He had been born and raised in the nearby city of Gonbad, a slightly larger and more urban town known for its bustling auto markets and dusty backstreets. He came from modest roots. His father, Rahman Kamali, had died in a road accident when Reza was just 7. His mother, Nilufar, raised him and his younger brother alone, running a small stand that sold roasted nuts and dried fruits in the local bazaar. The Kamali household was far from perfect. Nilufar was a sharp-tongued but fiercely protective mother, known in their alleyway as someone who didn't let her sons grow soft. Reza grew up navigating the harshness of early responsibility and the looseness of oversight. Without a steady father figure, he looked up to older boys in the neighborhood, many of whom taught him how to fix bikes, argue with charm, and move through life without leaving a trail. By the time Reza was in his 20s, he had earned a reputation as someone who could fix anything: cars, engines. He was never violent, but he was manipulative. Friendly on the surface, calculating underneath. He found work as a mobile parts delivery man, riding across towns on his aging motorcycle, known more for his charm than his discipline. He stayed just long enough to be remembered, but not long enough to be questioned. When he first saw Nasrin standing at her apartment doorway in Darvishan, she was holding her daughter Zara on her hip. Reza's encounter with Nasrin was accidental, but observers noted how frequently he began to appear in that neighborhood afterward. Their conversations began innocently, requests for deliveries, questions about repair work, but gradually grew more intimate. Nasrin, long deprived of warmth, began to open up. Reza listened, encouraged her to speak, praised her for her intelligence, and most dangerously, offered her something no one else did: validation. Over time, she began to anticipate his visits, and in those fleeting moments something grew, something dangerous. Reza was more than a sympathetic ear. He was a manipulator, skilled in reading emotional cracks and widening them. He knew Nasrin felt trapped. He knew she was lonely, and he began to suggest what she hadn't dared to think. As their connection deepened, Reza proposed a way out. If Hamid were no longer alive, Nasrin could finally breathe. He reminded her that under Iranian law, women with small children sometimes received clemency, especially if they confessed and showed remorse. He painted a picture of freedom, of a new life together, just the three of them. All Nasrin had to do was be brave. She didn't immediately agree, but the idea had taken root, but didn't stop them nurturing their relationship. Then came the rumors. In towns like Darvishan, secrets don't stay hidden. Neighbors had started to talk. Reza's visits had become too frequent. Someone had seen them standing too close. Word spread quickly, and eventually it reached Hamid. Hamid returned home one winter evening without warning. What he found, whether evidence or simply an atmosphere, set off a confrontation. Zara had just gone to sleep. Tension simmered in the kitchen. Voices rose. Coincidentally, Reza was passing by on his delivery route when he heard the shouting. He entered through the back entrance. What followed happened in minutes. Hamid confronted him. A struggle broke out in the kitchen. In the midst of shoving and shouting, a kitchen knife was drawn. Hamid was stabbed once, fatally, in the chest. The wound was deep and targeted. The room fell silent, except for Nasrin's scream. The plan, whatever it was, had turned real. Reza didn't wait. He fled immediately, leaving the door swinging open behind him. Nasrin called for help. She held her husband's head in her lap, crying, even as she knew the wound was fatal. When police arrived, she didn't mention Reza. She told them she had killed Hamid in fear, that he had attacked her, that she had panicked. It was the story Reza had prepared her for, one where she took the fall and was later spared. And at first, she believed it would work, but the aftermath unraveled the fantasy quickly. She was arrested to face the consequences of her action, but Hamid's family, enraged and grieving, refused any discussion of pardon. Zara was taken and placed with Hamid's elder sister, Marzia, a strict traditionalist who made it clear the child would be raised without any trace of her mother's memory. The next morning, news of Nasrin's arrest reached her own parents. Humiliated and enraged, they cut off contact. They declined to speak with the press, refused to visit her in jail, and offered no testimony during her trial. Their silence became a second verdict, one of social death. Nasrin was all alone, abandoned, and now facing a murder charge. Days turned into weeks behind the cold walls of a provincial detention center. Reality set in. The man who promised her love had used her. The plan had never been about building a life. It had been about eliminating a threat and then disappearing. That's when she changed her confession. She told authorities about Reza, that he had entered the house, that he had stabbed Hamid, that she had agreed to take the blame because he told her she'd be pardoned, that he promised to wait for her, and lied. Authorities were unmoved. They viewed the revised account as a desperate ploy. Her original confession had already been recorded, sealed in court documents. No evidence tied Reza to the scene. No fingerprints, no witnesses, no motive anyone wanted to investigate. The justice system had its conclusion. Nasrin took her husband's life. The courtroom was cold the morning Nasrin Vaziri was led into the dock. Draped in the navy chador of the provincial detention center, she appeared smaller than her age, withdrawn and visibly shaken. She stood alone before the bench in Elsvan Provincial Court, facing a justice system that had already begun to write her fate before she ever entered the room. What was meant to be a trial of evidence quickly became a trial of character. Nasrin's earlier confession, one in which she accepted full responsibility for the death of her husband, Hamid Alizadeh, was the foundation of the prosecution's case. Despite later recanting her statement and naming Reza Kamali as the true killer, the initial account had been recorded, processed, and accepted. To the court, it was enough. Prosecutors presented a simplified narrative. Hamid, a respected and traditional man, was portrayed as a stable provider. Though strict, there were no official complaints, no recorded allegations of abuse, no history of violence that could be corroborated by third parties. The absence of documented trauma worked against Nasrin. With no bruises, no witnesses, and no paper trail, her claims of emotional and psychological control were dismissed as excuses. Her revised confession, they argued, was an attempt to escape punishment now that she realized the weight of her decisions. Her legal representation was limited to a court-assigned public defender. Mr. Vahid Barami, an overworked man with little time or resources to conduct a deeper investigation. He tried to present Nasrin's story in context. He argued that she had been married off as a child, confined within a household where her independence was stripped from the beginning, and emotionally manipulated by an outsider who had since vanished. But in a court more concerned with preserving social order than examining systemic failures, such a defense carried little force. Witnesses from the community were sparse but impactful. A few neighbors described Nasrin as aloof, distant, and increasingly secretive in the months before the murder. None mentioned any direct abuse, but all referenced rumors, whispers of a man on a motorcycle seen near the house, and changes in Nasrin's demeanor. These insinuations, though vague, were enough to paint her as someone who had plotted, not panicked. Perhaps most damaging was the silence from her own family. Her parents, humiliated by the scandal, refused to appear in court. No character witnesses were called in her defense. The absence of support reinforced the narrative that Nasrin was alone because she deserved to be. Hamid's family, by contrast, appeared at every hearing. They described him as a dutiful son, a committed husband, and a father whose only flaw was expecting discipline in his home. They pushed for the harshest punishment possible, citing family honor and irreparable loss. Through it all, Nasrin spoke little. Her demeanor, stoic, subdued, was interpreted by many in the gallery as coldness, not trauma. To the court, her silence lacked remorse. To the public, it reinforced guilt. Beyond the courtroom, a quiet wave of attention was building. Human rights advocates began to circulate her case across online platforms. They raised concerns about the integrity of her confession, the lack of a proper investigation into Reza Kamali, and the social context surrounding her life. Married at 15, emotionally isolated, and systematically silenced, petitions were submitted. Letters were sent to judicial authorities urging clemency, particularly in light of her young daughter. But inside Iran's judicial structure, External pressures rarely swayed internal decisions. The judiciary maintained that her original confession was clear, voluntary, and legally binding. No evidence linking Reza Kamali to the crime scene had surfaced, and with his disappearance, his role remained speculative. Authorities treated Nasrin's revised account as a last-ditch attempt to redirect blame. Even appeals to compassion fell short. Nasrin's daughter Zahra was now a toddler and in the custody of Hamid's sister, Marzieh. The court ruled that it was in the child's best interest to remain with her paternal relatives. No provision was made for future contact. For Nasrin, that separation carried more weight than the bars around her. On February 19, 2010, the court announced its final judgment. Nasrin Vaziri was to be executed by hanging. The sentencing was delivered in a subdued tone, with no visible reaction from the bench. Appeals were filed, but legal experts predicted they would fail. And they did. In the months that followed, Nasrin was moved to Execvted Detention Center's high-security women's wing, placed under close supervision as her execution date neared. Her world narrowed to a 2-by-3-meter cell, a hard cot, and a small window with iron bars. Her daily routine consisted of prayer, silence, and writing. She kept journals that chronicled her inner world, grief for her daughter, betrayal by Reza, and reflections on the moments that had led her there. She received no visitors. Her letters, smuggled out through sympathetic guards or inmates, rarely reached their intended recipients. Many were intercepted. Some were never sent. The public, distracted by newer headlines, soon forgot about her. But for women's rights advocates, her case became a haunting symbol, a portrait of what happens when a system punishes those it was supposed to protect. Despite global calls for clemency, including from organizations advocating against child marriage and for judicial reform, the state remained firm. They stated that Nasrin had confessed, had been convicted under Iranian law, and had exhausted her appeals. She had no more chances. Her sentence was now a matter of procedure. What remained of her life was a routine countdown, one day at a time, toward a fate written not by justice, but by silence, betrayal, and a lifetime of being unheard. By the end of 2013, Nasrin Vaziri had stopped counting days. At first, she marked time on the edge of her mattress with tiny scratches, one for each sunrise and solitary confinement. But time in Execvted Detention Center became shapeless, with no visits, no news, and no hope. She rarely spoke. Even the guards, once stern and indifferent, had softened into silence around her. With her final appeal rejected, she was placed under death watch, a 24-hour surveillance regime reserved for condemned inmates in their final days. Her meals became simpler, her movement restricted. Her name was erased from the general roster. Nasrin had effectively disappeared from the system, reduced to a number on a log sheet and a date on the calendar. Her last requests were modest. She asked for writing paper, not food. She spent hours each day composing letters, not to the judiciary or the president, but to her daughter. Letters filled with the thoughts she was never allowed to say aloud. Hopes, regrets, and memories of Zahra's first words, her laugh, the sound of her tiny feet padding across their apartment floor. Each letter ended the same way. Never mailed, never delivered. The night before her execution, prison officials followed protocol. They allowed her a final prayer. A last meal was offered, traditional saffron rice and stew. She barely touched it. Instead, she sat cross-legged on the floor, whispering verses from memory. There were no tears, no breakdowns, only quiet resolve. On the morning of March 4, 2014, at precisely 4 a.m., prison guards entered her cell. She stood, dressed in the same navy chador she had worn throughout her trial. They shackled her wrists loosely and led her down the narrow corridor toward the execution chamber. Witnesses described the moment as unnervingly calm. Outside the prison, there were no crowds, no protests, no public presence. The execution was carried out in silence, with only a handful of state officials, a prison doctor, and a cleric present. By 4:27 a.m., Nasrin Vaziri was pronounced dead. No relatives came to claim her body. It was buried in an unmarked grave at the prison cemetery on the outskirts of Execvted. Her name was not listed on public records. Official media made no mention of her execution, but outside Iran, the silence sparked outrage. Within hours, international human rights organizations condemned the act. Statements were released by women's rights coalitions, child marriage advocacy groups, and UN-affiliated agencies. Her execution, they argued, underscored a systemic failure: a woman forced into marriage at 15, denied agency, manipulated into a murder she did not fully orchestrate, and ultimately abandoned by both the law and her lover. Digital campaigns began to circulate, sharing Nasrin's story with her face sketched from prison descriptions. No real photograph was ever published. Hashtags demanded reform. Articles questioned how many more girls like her were hidden in Iran's legal system, caught between cultural expectation and legal rigidity. For years, Reza Kamali remained a ghost in the narrative. His whereabouts unknown. No formal warrant ever named him as a suspect. Though Nasrin had spoken his name in court, no state entity pursued the lead with any visible effort. The absence of justice for his involvement became another wound layered over the truth of her story. If this story moved you, share it. Don't let Nasrin's silence be the last word. Leave a comment. Let us know what justice means to you. Use your voice on social media, in your community, in your home. Subscribe to this channel because we tell the stories meant to be buried. For every Nasrin, there are thousands more. Still living, still waiting, still unheard. Together, we can make sure that the next girl doesn't die in silence. Let's keep this conversation alive, because the moment we stop talking, the silence wins.